Welcome to tonight's lecture. This is the second in a series of 3 public lectures inspired by the work of John Yon and presented as part of a set of statewide events to commemorate the 125th anniversary of the founding of the University of Oregon. The Yon Lecture Series honors the memory and legacy of John Yon. The series broadly reflects the 3 major interests which Yon pursued throughout his career: architecture, landscape design and preservation, and the decorative arts. These lectures are made possible with a special gift from U of O landscape architecture alumna Joan Gray, who worked with us to develop the idea for a series, and with additional support from the University of Oregon 125th Anniversary Celebration Project, sponsored by the U of O Alumni Association and the U of O Foundation. This winter series continues tonight with Joe Noero, and I also want to invite you to join us on April 22nd at the same time to hear a lecture by Laurie Olin, landscape architect from the Olin Partnership in Philadelphia. After the lecture this evening, please join us for a reception in the lobby. John Yon was a pioneer in the 20th century's fundamental rethinking of art and architecture, a native Oregonian and largely self-taught. His brilliant design work included not only residences and other buildings, but also interiors, gardens, landscapes, furnishings, and museum installations. Our lecture tonight by architect Joe Noero of Cape Town, South Africa, reflects one aspect of John Yon's lifelong interests, his concern and dedication to architectural design. John Yon's architectural career spanned almost 50 years. His first work, completed in partnership with Pietro Belluschi in 1933, was a set of sketches for what was to be Timberline Lodge. This design, of course, was never realized. 3 years later, Aubrey Watzik commissioned the office of A.B. Doyle to design a house, requesting that Yon serve as the person in charge of that project. At 26 years old, Yon designed his first and arguably his most famous residence, the Watzik House. He viewed design as a comprehensive opportunity. For the Watzik House, his work included the site design and much of the furniture for that property. And he continued this pattern of subsequent residential designs. When it was completed in 1938, the Watzik House became known as a premier design of the Northwest style and was published widely in Europe and North America. Sited high in Portland's West Hills, the Watzik House, built of native woods and exquisitely detailed, is aligned to a spectacular view of Mount Hood. Photographs of the house, including one in which the roof lines are clearly echoed by the mountains in the distance, were shown in New York's Museum of Modern Art in 1938 and featured in subsequent exhibitions and MoMA publications, including the book Built in USA 1932 to 1944. This early exposure brought international interest in Yon's work, which, along with the work of his contemporary Pietro Belluschi, became known as the Pacific Northwest regional style. Yon continued his residential designs until the early 1950s, at which time the focus of his design sensibilities turned to 2 other areas: the conservation of Oregon's natural heritage and the design of museum galleries and installation. The School of Architecture and Allied Arts has received 3 major Yon properties as generous donations. These, of course, are the Watzik House in Portland, the Shire in the Columbia River Gorge, and the George and Margaret Cottrell House, also in Portland. The set of donations helps us to enrich the experiences of students in the arts and design, architecture, historic preservation, and landscape architecture. The school is only one of a handful of colleges around the country with such educational assets available for in-depth experiential learning opportunities. I'm very pleased to welcome Joe Noero here this evening to talk about his architecture and the changing nature of South African cities after the 1894 liberation. We spent a wonderful afternoon together, and I'm sure we are all in for a treat this evening. Joe, let me formally welcome you to Oregon and hope that this, although your first visit, will not be your last. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you Professor Howard Davis from the Department of Architecture.
Thank you, Robert, and I'd like to add my own welcome to all of our guests at this first architecture lecture in the John Yon Lecture Series. Through his work, John Yon showed how architectural modernism might be consistent with the idea that buildings could be firmly anchored in the world around them and might represent improvements to that world. Our speaker tonight, Joe Noero, has worked tirelessly as a professional and as an educator to show the possibility of an architecture that is grounded in the life and culture of a society that is rapidly changing and in which buildings and places may play a pivotal role in a positive future. Since the end of the apartheid system in 1994, the world has been looking with a good deal of hope toward South Africa, looking to understand how brutal oppression might be replaced by mutual respect, looking toward the possibility of a society which might value the life and worth of every individual who's a part of it. In the United States, the idea that the cities and neighborhoods and schools and houses, which form the locus of people's everyday lives, might be the most important focus of architectural concern, has fallen out of favor in the last 15 or 20 years. The financial bottom line and the image-based buildings that it requires have displaced social responsibility. Society has come to look more to developers to shape our cities than it has to architects and landscape architects and planners and people themselves. But almost exactly 6 months ago, we were tragically jolted out of our complacency. Suddenly, we're not so different from other countries in the world, and the discussions which are now taking place about the future of Lower Manhattan raise critical issues of diversity and equity and urban vitality, along with the failure of the speculative market to deal with them. These issues are relevant not only to New York, but to many other of our cities as well. I believe that our speaker tonight has much to say that can be useful to us, as we may now be in an ideal opportunity to reorder our own social and architectural priorities. In South Africa, the difficult work of building a new society is involving the reform and recreation and legitimization of many different institutions at different levels, ranging from the judicial system to local community organizations, and requiring the active involvement of professionals of all kinds. As an architect and teacher, Joe Noero has been central to that effort. With talent, empathy, and optimism, he has committed himself to the design of buildings which foster community and support the basic human dignity that all people deserve. Joe Noero is professor of architecture and director of the School of Architecture at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He is also no stranger to this country. In 1996, he was appointed the Ruth and Norman Moore Professor of Architecture at the School of Architecture at Washington University in St. Louis, and he was Director of Graduate Studies at that school for 3 years. Joe Noero was educated at the University of Natal in South Africa and at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. Since 1984, he has been the principal of an architecture firm in Johannesburg, which has built over 150 buildings in the last 10 years, including community centers, schools, housing, libraries, a house for Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and a remarkable museum of apartheid in Port Elizabeth, which I believe he's talking about tonight. His work has been extensively published in the Architectural Review, Architectural Record, and many other publications. He's been the subject of television documentaries and featured in several books about contemporary architecture. He has frequently lectured at schools and conferences all over the world. He is also the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including election as Fellow of the Academy of Science of South Africa, as an honorary Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, recipient of the Ruth and Ralph Erskine Fellowship from the Nordic Association of Architects, and many others. Joe Noero well understands the difficult challenges that face both the profession of architecture and the institution of architectural education. He has not shirked from difficult questions. Indeed, he has begun to show how the design of beautiful buildings might be consistent with the idea of positive social change, and how the teaching of architecture might help a profession which is at present undervalued by society at large. It is therefore a great pleasure to introduce an architect and teacher who so fully embraces the idea that buildings are as important as they are in people's lives, and who is acting on that belief to help rebuild a country in which the world has placed so much hope. Please join me in welcoming Joe Noero.
That was very kind. Hello? Yeah. Is that all right? Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Howard. That was very kind of you. What you said really encapsulates what I was going to say tonight, so I'll just show you some pictures instead. I'm very honored to have been invited to come to the University of Oregon to give this talk to you, and I'd like to thank everyone for an extraordinary display of hospitality, and I really have felt very welcome, and thank you very much. Onto the slides. I'm going to just try and figure out how the lights work. Okay. Okay. I thought that what I would do this evening is to talk to you about South Africa and the changes that have happened in South Africa through some of the work that I've been involved in as an architect over the last 15 years or so in the country. And talk to you about work that we did in our practice before 1990, when really significant change happened in South Africa, which was initiated by the release of Mr. Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years in solitary confinement on Robben Island. And the kind of way in which the work that we're involved in the country has in fact changed. I just would like to reiterate what Howard said, which is that I think that one of the experiences I had working and teaching in the United States for a 5-year period was, in a sense, what I gathered to be quite a deep pessimism amongst most architects and planners, that the actions of designers on the built environment have very little consequence other than to make profit for developers. And certainly, I think in South Africa, the spirit of modernism and of the modern movement is alive and well, that most architects are imbued with a sense of social purpose, and we do believe that the work that we do can help to make the world a better place. And that's certainly what is driving most of contemporary South African architecture today. To start off with some kind of description about the country, the slide on here is an interesting slide for me because it deals with the dilemmas and the paradoxes of how it is that we even begin to describe the new emerging South Africa. South Africa obviously was colonized about 350 years ago. The city that I live in Cape Town, was colonized by the Dutch at the same time as New York in the early 1600s. And the country has gone through successive waves of colonial domination, and then in 48 was subjected to a legalized or a legislated form of racial segregation. And the subdivision of the land in southern Africa and in Africa generally was really shaped by colonial domination. And this map that is on your right-hand side over here is really what is beginning to emerge in South Africa, which is a new definition of what constitutes boundary and what constitutes mapping. This is a mapping of South Africa which really dismisses entirely the idea of the cadastral boundary, which was drawn up by the colonial surveyors, and really starts to look at a new kind of mapping of the country in which tribal boundaries and in which ethnic enclaves are represented as the authentic mapping of the country. And this has caused a complete new shift in how it is that we think about the country. It's a very complicated country because we have 11 official languages, and we have to hold together this real mixed bag of very, very different peoples. Yet on the other hand, the image on the other slide is an image of downtown Johannesburg, which is a huge industrial complex. It's probably the economic powerhouse of sub-Saharan Africa. It's on a plateau 6,000 feet above sea level. It has a hot, dry climate. It has clear, cloudless, sunny winter days and freezing cold evenings. And when we have a cold snap, it's such a huge city that one night, I think about 3 years ago, we had a particularly cold snap. We consumed almost a quarter of sub-Saharan's electrical or energy that night. It's a city that's grown from nothing 100 years ago. It was founded on the basis of the world's richest gold reef, which runs in an east-west axis through the city, to a city today which is probably about 6-7 million people. It's growing very rapidly. It's a magnet for people from all over Africa who come here to seek work. And it's estimated that it's going to double its population in the next 8 years. So by the year 2010, it'll be 12 million. And after that, it'll become another global city like you find anywhere in the world. It's bursting at the seams. But there are these kinds of paradoxes of both a very underdeveloped rural economy and a very, very developed formal economy. And it's in that kind of tension between these two poles that I think huge opportunities exist. The forms of settlement, of habitation of the landscape are really characterized by two dominant types. The one type is the typical township pattern of development, which really belongs to the apartheid township, which really were conceived as dormitory towns in which migrant black workers were accommodated. They had no legal rights in these townships. They had no rights, in fact, other than the fact that they had the right to come to the city to sell their labor as cheaply as possible. These dormitory towns were spatially displaced on the outskirts of the city, so that these people lived at relatively low densities, far away from work opportunities, and were moved in great numbers into and out of the city each day to work and sell their labor. Concurrently with that, though, what is emerging in South Africa is another form of housing production, which has really taken precedence over the government planned settlements of the pre-1990s period, which are the spontaneous shack developments which are occurring on all the urban peripheries of our South African cities. 90% of housing production in South Africa at the present time in any 1 year is produced in this fashion. And it's very sensible housing, certainly housing that is much better planned and designed than architects or planners could possibly conceive. For example, the settlement on the right-hand side is just outside Johannesburg, and as you can see, it's very sensibly planned. People build close to the road where opportunities are in terms of access to transport. The density thins out from that road edge as you move further away from it, so the housing density decreases. There's a very, very sensible system of plot subdivision. It's entirely negotiated. It's negotiated informally, and it's very compact. And over time, these settlements become recognized. People are granted full tenure to the properties. Services are provided, and they're gradually upgraded until they constitute legitimate urban environments where people can, in fact, exchange their properties in the open property market. I am often asked by students in America whether the shack settlement is a phenomenon of Africa, of the developing world. I would remind all of you that, in fact, all cities started off as shack settlements. And in fact, America only 70 years ago had a huge number of shack settlements, which I believe you called Hoovervilles, which grew as a result of the Great Depression. Rome, which is the eternal city of the Western world, has a couple of shack settlements on its outskirts. They form very, very useful purposes. I'm not suggesting that this in any way represents social justice. It doesn't. But in the case of people being denied any means of access to reasonable housing, when they take action for themselves, they normally do it resourcefully, and they do it at no cost to the state. That 90% of all constructed housing, as I said before, that has been built in South Africa each year since 1990, doesn't cost the state anything. So it's a very effective form of housing production. What we're trying in South Africa now is to find ways and means of intervening in this process to ensure that the housing that gets built has a reasonable chance of living beyond the life of the settlement. Many traditional forms of housing exist in South Africa, from the circular rondavel, beehive hut. The beehive hut was originally a woven shelter, a very ingenious system of natural ventilation. It was made out of woven reeds, and in Zululand, where you have a very hot, humid climate, what would happen is that on hot days, which would usually dry, the woven matting would expand, would contract. Air gaps would appear between the matting, and you would be able to ventilate the space by drawing sea breezes across it. And then obviously when it rains, it swells up and becomes a watertight membrane. So it was a very, for me at any rate, a very, very sophisticated form of designing a building that breathed. The traditional, okay, I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm not very good at focusing, and is this, oh, fantastic, someone's doing it. The predominant form of rural housing is this painted housing, which really belongs, in this case, to the Ndebele people, and it forms a very, very sophisticated form of housing. The house on the right-hand side is a typical farmstead outside Johannesburg, near Pretoria, and it makes a fantastic presence in a flat horizontal landscape, and it comprises a very, very sophisticated set of thresholds that one moves through, from very public courtyards, gradually increasing in privacy until one gets into the courtyard opposite the front door to the house, which is then only open to family members. So by the time you come to the front door, you are a very privileged guest if you're allowed into the house. And you don't need signs, you don't need locked doors, you simply know it because of the spatial sequence that one moves through. The other slide, I think, for me, starts to talk about the thing that I'm really interested in, which we'll be talking about tonight, which is the capacity of, I think, generally African culture to both absorb external cultural influences and to collect those influences and to incorporate them into indigenous cultures without causing the collapse of that indigenous culture. This, for me, is a very beautiful peasant's home in a rural area in Mpumalanga. It's a painted house like these houses over here, but this house learns many, many lessons from the Dutch homesteads that surround this farm. It's bilaterally symmetrical. It has windows which are embellished. It has a cornice which is made out of mud and painted, and it has a fantastic plinth that surrounds the building, so that they've clearly understood the architectural elements of the adjoining Dutch homesteads and have incorporated the language of those homesteads into their own houses, in their own decorated houses, but found a way of being able to do that without causing a collapse of their indigenous culture. The houses themselves, the coloration on the outside is carried through to the inside, and the insides in many, many cases are even more brightly colored than the external faces of the building. The other fantastic quality about these homes is that they're made out of mud and they're painted every year. And when the rains come, the coloration is displaced and they're repainted in the dry season. All the building work is done by women, and the painting is done by the women as well. So these houses are in a continual process of transformation. They change from year to year, and very, very subtle kinds of changes are made. A friend of mine has charted the kinds of changes that have occurred in 10 or 15 of these homesteads. And it's quite extraordinary to sort of see the fantastic eye that's brought each year to make a change and adjustment to the fabric of the house in terms of the decoration, yet without losing the overall composition. quality of South Africa, of the cultural expression that's emerging in South Africa, I find very interesting. On the right-hand side is an envelope that was painted by a now very famous Zulu artist, Tito Zungu, who was an illiterate cook, who worked on a sugar farm outside Durban and Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, who developed a series of very, very beautiful drawings done in colored big ballpoint pens. And it really has to do with a kind of African reading of modern technology, the jet airplane. It's unmistakably an airplane, but it has a specific kind of character that is unmistakably African. And I find that a very powerful idea, and that's emerging more and more in the country. The other slide shows you a kind of African interpretation of a spaghetti junction on a highway. Tito Zungu, also another drawing of Tito Zungu's, which again I'm intrigued by, because it really has to do with an African interpretation of a multi-storied set of city buildings. Buildings that I think if we could build in South Africa would really make for a fantastic urban landscape. The other slide is one that I use a lot in talking about the sheer inventiveness and the cultural adaptation of many, many African people. And when I talk about African, I'm not talking about black Africans. I'm talking about the people who are indigenous to South Africa, who include whites and Indian people, or people of Asian descent, and black African people. These two kids live in a shack settlement, which you can see in the background, which is adjacent to Cape Town International Airport, and it's in the flight path of the jumbo jets that take off and land every couple of hours at the airport. They've probably never received any formal education, and simply by observation, they've constructed a working model of a jumbo jet with retractable wheels that slip into the base of the body of the plane. The plane is made out of flattened oil cans, which are then shaped and adjusted to sort of form the model. It's a beautifully scaled and proportioned piece of work. And one of the things that we ask our students when they come into first year as one of their first drawing exercises to draw from memory a jumbo jet. And none of them can get it right. And these are kids who have flown in these jets. These kids, by simple observation and a bit of creativity, have actually managed to make a fantastic working model. So it's that kind of quality that I think we're really keen at tapping into in the work that we've done. This next set of slides are really going to be a set of buildings that we did in the period 1985 to 1990. And we did really about 100 of these buildings. And they comprised a series of community buildings, careers centers, alternative education centers, and so on. They were largely funded by international donor money, and they were built in response to the education crisis that emerged in South Africa. The ANC called upon the youth of the country to make the townships and the cities ungovernable, and this meant that all symbols of so-called civil society, schools, police stations, were targeted by kids. There were mass boycotts of schooling, and in response to that, a number of alternative schools were constructed in the townships in an attempt to provide at least some kind of education for those kids who were willing to attend school. This is a building that we did in Soweto called the Soweto Career Center. The reason why I show this set of images is to really talk to you about a position that we adopted during this period. We felt that we were living through a tumultuous period, that the country was in the process of transformation. We were doing a lot of work in the townships of South Africa at the time. And there was a speculation in the universities at that time, schools of architecture, about the development of a kind of appropriate South African architecture. And we were utterly opposed to that idea, because we felt until liberation it would be impossible to even speculate about what might constitute a South African culture, because we could only start to really help to construct that with liberation and real democracy, and it would be a process that would grow from the bottom up in response to people, and it would be a patient search, and it would take maybe generations. So the buildings that we constructed, we designed, were buildings which, in a sense, were culturally neutral buildings. And what we were interested in was in working from first principles in the design of these buildings, that these were buildings that were designed to respond to particular aspects of program. And when I talk about program, I'm not talking about use or function, I'm talking about purpose, the celebration of purpose, dealing with questions of climate and designing buildings that were comfortable, cool in summer, warm in winter. And more importantly for us as well, to design buildings that were literally transparent. In other words, buildings that would reveal in their making the nature of the structure that was employed in the design of the buildings, the particular use of materials and how different materials were used and why they were used in the particular ways that they were. In effect, a very didactic kind of show and expression of structure and material use. We felt very comfortable doing this because we felt that by developing an architecture that took this as a position, that we would not have to enter the hot and politicized territory of culture and cultural expression, particularly at that time when the country was not free and the vast majority of people didn't have a voice. So this set of buildings here, the Careers Center, for example, the structure is expressed in as clear and unadorned way as it possibly can be. The section of the building is revealed through the side elevation of the building. One can read how the section of the building works through the external treatment of the elevation, so it becomes literally transparent. And it's a building that's shaped around the idea of drawing cool air in at the bottom and having a huge funnel-shaped section at the top, which turns away from the prevailing winds, which means that you get a vacuum behind the opening, which draws air through the building and takes it out through the top. But that also is used as a form of indirect lighting down into the hall. The sense that we had about this was that also this construction was rooted in a study that we did at the university, which looked at shack construction. The point of view that we took was that if we to look anywhere in South Africa at that time, to try and find a kind of authentic architectural expression, the only place we would be able to find it would be in the shack settlements. We're talking about urban areas, because it was in these areas that people were most free to be able to develop the kind of architecture that they needed to accommodate themselves. So many of these buildings that I'll be showing you are attempts to try and read and understand the technology and use of materials in the shack settlements and the way in which structure was made, and to then formalize those patterns, those languages of construction and structure and material use, and give it architectural expression. And it was an attempt to sort of say to people living in shacks, you're not doing so badly. There's an emerging urban tradition that you have at your fingertips, and what we want to do is to try and help you in being able to develop that language in a more sophisticated way. Also, many of these buildings that you'll see were built by local communities, working in work brigades under our direct supervision as architects. And obviously the technology that we wanted to employ would be a technology that would be familiar to them, although a much more sophisticated reading of that technology. Some of the computer center and the internal view of that space. An interesting aside, the coloration of these buildings in most cases you will see is black, green, and yellow or gold. That had to do with the colors of the ANC, black for the people of the country, green for the land, and gold for the wealth under the land. Unfortunately, the ANC at that time was a banned organization which included the public display of their colors. And I spent a couple of times locked up in police stations for painting buildings these colors, if you can believe it. That's how ridiculous apartheid was. Another set of buildings that again tried to deal, this is a set of resource centers, again built adjacent to a shack settlement. We employed people from the shack settlement to do the construction. And again, a very didactic employment of structure, materials, order of materials, and order of space, and a fairly complicated system of being able to light spaces to bring light and ventilation to spaces. These are community offices, which are structured along the idea of a street, which becomes a social space and a meeting space for people. I put this in because I had a conversation with some students this afternoon, and I thought, it might be a good idea to talk about, I was talking about the kind of what I've always been amazed about is I guess it might not necessarily be true to this school, but in American schools where I've taught before, when one talks about functionalism, one's met with an absolute sort of stony silence. And I figure that the reason for that is that it's associated with ideas of utilitarianism and efficiency, which really seems to be the way in which large sections of American society have been organized. The purpose, the use of the word functionalism, certainly in South African terms, is much more rooted in the kind of Western European and modern movement sense of purpose, of celebration of purpose. And this, for example, was a small resource center that we did outside Johannesburg with 2 gigantic big staircases that lead up to the administration block. But these big ears over here are, in fact, capture sun in the wintertime. The wintertime days are very cold but sunny. The sun is quite low. And really, these become wonderfully warm places in summertime. And the staircases were designed as not only staircases, but as social spaces. They became classrooms, and they became outside classrooms. So during the winter days, kids would move from the classrooms adjacent to the courtyard and have classes conducted on the staircase, out in the sun, and nice and warm. And the purpose of just talking about that is just this idea that when you deal with purpose and not utilitarian functionalism, you can find all sorts of, I think, interesting ways of adding new uses and new readings to what we consider to be fairly conventional elements like staircases. Oops-a-daisy. I don't know what is going on, but forgive me. I'll just have to, okay. Very, very simple buildings. This is a set of AIDS clinics that we built in the late 1980s, employing traditional barn construction, agricultural shed construction, simple steel portal frame, clad in corrugated sheeting, and then brightly painted because the landscapes within which these buildings were located were essentially horizontal ones, and we tried to use these buildings as urban markers within that space. We were commissioned by the British government and built about 15 of these centers in a very, very short period of time. We had about 5 months to spend the money that they gave us. So they had to be assembled very, very quickly, but very, very cheaply built. These buildings, I think, in present exchange rates, although they were built maybe 10 years ago, worked out at about $10,000 each. Another set of buildings. This is referred to as the Elephant Building, and then very, very simple spaces in the inside. They were designed as AIDS centers, but primarily as AIDS education centers. People were not treated here. They were simply, people were brought in. There were also family planning clinics, and there would be huge gatherings of people, and information would be disseminated. Another set of buildings. This is a series of sports centers that we did for the National Sports Congress. Now, none of these buildings were, in fact, designed for the previous government. So we were working, in a sense, in the NGO, non-governmental organization sector, with a huge number of activist groups, trade unions, and other groups who were, whilst we were building these buildings, were using these buildings as a way and means of helping to sustain and support the internal struggle for freedom in the country. This building is very typical of some small houses that we did at the time. And again, I think the only reason why I show this is that idea of literal transparency, that you can read the structure of the building. It's a mezzanine level. You read that on the outside of the structure. The steel frame is exposed. In a hot, dry climate, you don't have a huge amount of moisture in the air. You also don't have a huge amount of movement in the structure of the building if you take certain precautions, which we quickly learnt about after doing a couple of buildings which failed. But that seems to be how most architects work. But a very simple building with a huge preoccupation with dealing with things like this, the sun, a decent cross ventilation, and so on. The building as it was completed, and again, an idea of a balustrade in a house, which becomes more than a balustrade. It becomes a structural element that helps to break the span of the steel members that form the roof, which means that you can use a smaller and therefore more efficient steel section. it becomes a balustrade, it becomes a structural steel member, and then it also becomes a frame to filter the light that's brought in through a roof light in the middle of the building. What's interesting, and this is what I find so exciting, is the kind of inventiveness of people. This house is in a place called Alexandra Township, and the owner moved out of the house, sold it on, and today it's a small grocery store downstairs. Where the living room is at the bottom level, this is where the old kitchen was, this is where the store is. The bottom level is got 2 pool tables, so it's a hangout place for late night. And then the 2 bedrooms upstairs have been converted into a dormitory space where they sleep 8 people. So this is a house that is in fact a social condenser. And it's a tiny house of only 100 square meters, 1,000 square foot, and yet it's a shop, it's an entertainment center, and it's a place for sleeping. This is where the pool table is, the 2 pool tables. Some commercial office buildings that we also did at the time, in which we took these lessons and these ideas that we were developing in the townships and brought them into the formal sector, the affluent sector, if you want to call it, of Johannesburg. This was a set of commercial office buildings that we did that were 11.5 meters wide, central corridor, and 5 meter wide offices on either side. Built out of a steel frame, but with a system of adjustable louvers that we developed using shade cloth on a very lightweight galvanized steel frame, which meant that you didn't need any complicated mechanism to adjust the louvers. They could be adjusted internally by the individual occupants in the offices and would provide you with 80% shading. And that's a view of one of the office buildings we did. We did 3 or 4 of them. Taken early in the morning, and you can actually see the preference of the occupants. They adjust them in all sorts of strange ways, nothing like you would anticipate. Some people like early morning light, others don't. So half the offices are shut down as if they're asleep, and the other half are awake, looking out towards the view. But the shade cloth has an agricultural use in South Africa, and it's used mainly for horticulture. And is a fantastic material which is very light. And what is fantastic about these shades is that they're porous, so you can ventilate across them, so you don't get the problem of the brise-soleil with the huge heat buildup between, well, the absorption of heat by the mass of the brise-soleil and then the transmission of that heat inwards during the daytime into the offices that sit across the air gap from the brise-soleil. So it's a very effective and I think a very cost-effective way of being able to make a system of cooling a building down without great cost. The other thing that we employed in a hot, dry climate, you can use an evaporative cooling system, which is precisely what we employed in this building. You have a huge fan, you draw air in across a wet surface, you humidify it, it drops by 3-4 degrees in temperature, and then you pump that air through the building, and you have open windows, and you evacuate the air through the open windows and just draw fresh air back into the building. So it's a fantastic way of cooling a building, and this was a building which didn't need any air conditioning or heating. Part of the reason why I'm probably emphasizing this question of working with climate in the South African context is that we simply cannot afford to air condition and heat our buildings. It's only the sort of very expensive corporate buildings that get built in the center of our cities that we can do that. The vast majority of buildings have actually got to be naturally lit, ventilated, and heated, so we have to be inventive. And I think that gives us a fantastic scope, which I think, unfortunately, you're denied in the United States because of your obsession with air conditioning and heating systems. A set of buildings, I always tell the story because this was done for an American company, a film production company in Johannesburg, who used to have offices in Frank Gehry's building in Santa Monica with the gigantic big binoculars on the outside, and came to South Africa and in fact fell in love with Johannesburg and were very keen to build what they saw to be a building that would reflect upon the emerging urban tradition in terms of shack buildings. So this was a film production company, but the reason why I show it is that it has a gigantic passageway that runs through the building, which becomes much broader. It becomes a street, it becomes a social space. People congregate in it. But then again, a strategy that we employ repeatedly in the country, in Johannesburg, which is that you bring light in through the center of the building, so that you can you can light up the central street, and then you open the rooms on either side of the street with windows, opening windows and doors on either side, so you can draw air through them and ventilate them, but you also get a lot of natural light in the space, which gives a sense of a much bigger room than it actually is. And then simply by allowing the sun to come in through the top, you get a heat build up there, but you use exhaust fans on either side of the building, and you suck that air out, and you then induce an airflow. So it becomes a naturally ventilated and cool building very, very easily with almost no energy cost. And in this case, this was a building where the challenge that was placed to us was that the elements that we would use, it wasn't out of cheapness, it was rather that Barry Munchik, the client, knew the Eames house in Santa Monica and wanted us to build a house out of components found in the South African equivalent of a Home Depot. So we were restricted to those elements that you could buy in the Home Depot, and they had to be already prefabricated and pre-made components. So it really became a building that was really an assemblage of bits and pieces that you could literally go into a big hardware shop and pick off the shelf and bring onto the building site. Interestingly enough, there wasn't any significant cost saving for us in employing the system, because many, many times we had very awkward junctions that we had to resolve between these different components, and a lot of money went into resolving that. And then a view of the internal street and a sense of how those production offices in particular work off the internal street. And a sort of sense of how light the building can be, and if you don't have to seal it and air condition and heat it. This is quite a grotesque house in some ways, because I worked on it, and it was for a very young couple, a very wealthy couple, good people. One of the things that we do in our practice, which is probably, I'm not sure that you do in the United States, but I tell it and people seem to think it's funny, but we take it very seriously. When we get interviewed for jobs, we also tell the clients who come to interview us that we're interviewing them, that there are only certain people that we'll work for, and we want to make sure that there's a compatibility between our values and their values. And it's quite interesting because it throws people completely. And they stop interviewing you and you interview them, which is sometimes quite a useful device. But this is a fairly typical big house that we would have done in Johannesburg at the time. Hot, dry climate wrapped around a courtyard, openings made in the building fabric surrounding the courtyard so you could draw air across the water in the direction, the openings obviously in the direction of prevailing winds, draw air across the water in the swimming pool and cool the air down, and then draw it into the house. All the rooms are wrapped around the house, and then in quite a clear and didactic way, the ceiling is shaped as a way and means of drawing that air through and then taking the air out through top-lit windows placed at the top of the room. So again, the form shaped in response to an attempt to sort of deal with issues of climate, heating and cooling and so on. This is what I just put in as a matter of interest, but for me it's a very important building. It's a mediation center that was designed for Archbishop Desmond Tutu in the grounds of the Bishop of Johannesburg's home in Johannesburg, and it was designed in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was a center where what was emerging at the time was huge conflict emerging on the in workplaces between trade unions and what were then predominantly white industrialists. And one of the capacities of South Africans has been that in moments of trouble, they turn to church leaders for guidance. And what Desmond Tutu did was built this mediation center, and many very serious conflicts that arose in South Africa actually mediated in this tiny little building, the bottom end of the Bishop's Garden in Johannesburg. And it was quite an extraordinary kind of sense of being able to work on a building like this and know that this building and this set of spaces was going to be used for this purpose. Desmond Tutu has a wonderful sense of humor, and it was at his insistence that we put in this translucent ring of lighting, which he referred to as a halo. And his party trick was at night time to take guests down there, switch the light on, and have the halo above his head, and talk that he'd been visited by God. Another set of buildings which really, a set of educational buildings. This is Community College, which was the first one to be built in South Africa, which comprised some lecture halls and an administrative building. But I really wanted to show that, again, the development of that idea, in this case, not of horizontal brise-soleil, adjustable brise-soleil, but vertical ones. A circular building, and then what is now emerging in South Africa are painted buildings where local artists are brought in, and wall murals are a very predominant form of cultural expression in South Africa, and they're very didactic. They tell stories, and in a sense what they're doing is they're making buildings legible. If you don't understand the building, what you do is you understand the paintings that are applied to the wall surface of the building, and there's a strong storytelling and oral tradition in South African culture. The internal spaces, again, a fairly complex system of ventilating these spaces and bringing light in, but what I'm very proud of is in the lecture theatres, we developed an acoustical ceiling system which really gave fantastic sound, but it really comprised bench sheets of corrugated polycarbonate sheeting, which floated like clouds above the space. I'm going to show you some housing now, which really deals with some of the issues that I think we were confronted with in South Africa. This is Alexandra Township outside Johannesburg, a very desirable place for people to live because it's close to work, it's close to an industrial area. And it was established at the time that Johannesburg was established 100 years ago, and originally comprised a series of freestanding villas on quarter-acre plot subdivisions. But as the pressure on land increased, the owners of these houses, in an attempt to sort of maximize their use of their land, allowed people to build shacks on the land, and they would charge a rent for it, to the extent that it's now this kind of density. And we were invited by the United Democratic Front about 15 years ago to develop a piece of ground adjacent to Alexandra Township in which we would have a look at alternative housing systems to help rehouse some of the people living in these very overcrowded conditions in Alexandra Township. Because the problem was that these are highly unsanitary parts of a very unsanitary and very unhealthy neighborhood, in that there are almost no services there, no clean water and certainly no sanitation. And in order to upgrade the settlement, there was a need to thin out the density. So what we were really looking at is developing a pilot scheme adjacent to Alexandra Township, where the people who would be displaced by the upgrading project would be able to be moved to. And we built 100 houses, and then Alexandra Township burst into open warfare because the people who lived in these houses here were ANC supporters, and you can see in the background there gigantic big hostel blocks which were occupied by Zulu people from the Inkatha Freedom Party, and open warfare erupted between them. And for about 10 years, Alexandra Township was unmanageable. The police and military couldn't get in, and it was a very tense place. Hundreds and hundreds of people lost their lives. It was very tragic. But the kind of conditions in which people lived. This is a home, recycled materials. What is amazing about these kinds of houses, because many of the people who lived in these houses were in formal employment in Sandton, which is the adjoining suburb to Alexandra Township. And you would get and drive. I used to drive into Alexandra Township early in the morning because that was the safest time to go in to visit the site. And you would see women emerging from these shacks dressed in starched nurses' uniforms, going on their way to work at the local hospital, for example. And it always amazed me that someone could live in a shack like this and still look absolutely spotless in a white starched nurse's uniform. People are unbelievably enterprising and I think creative in dealing with adversity. The thing that I think we were very proud of in terms of Alexandra Township, this is some of the housing we built. It was built by this community of people. The 100 families who were accommodated by us were trained up in building skills. A cooperative was set up with local women who set up a block-making company. Was that we developed what we referred to as the pensioners' house. Pensioners at that time in South Africa got almost no support from the state, and there were many, many elderly people in this community who really had no means of support whatsoever, and because the extended family system had broken down, were really destitute. And what we did is developed a plot subdivision, which was approximately, it was 700 square foot in area, and the house itself was 170 square foot in area. Which really was built in this position over here. It comprised a room and then a wet core. But what we did is we then investigated the rental structure in Alexandra Township and actually found that if you built a room across from the original house and rented it out and provided these people with access to the wet core, the rental return that you would get from that single room would be more than sufficient to cover the costs of the mortgage repayments of the pensioner. So we actually developed a housing system where pensioners would be provided with housing, which they would own. They'd be able to take out a mortgage, but they would live there mortgage free. And that was an idea that I think soon grabbed hold of a lot of people. And it's become part of current South African housing policy, which is to view housing as a form of as a form of income generation. And all housing now in South Africa is designed to support all sorts of systems of being able to generate income. If I just go back to that plan. The organization of the houses was that it was the houses were wrapped around one point of entry, one point of exit, 50 houses wrapped around a central space, no car access at all. In a reasonably prosperous economy, I believe the ratio, and one of the indicators of a prosperous economy is the ratio between the cost of an automobile and a house is about 8 to 1, 10 to 1. In South Africa, it's 1 to 1. So the people who can't afford these houses are never going to be able to afford an automobile. But embedded in the center of each one of these neighborhoods was what we euphemistically called a parking area, but in fact it became a light industrial factory area. So that this was, in effect, a self-sustaining neighborhood wrapped around with houses. There were some existing houses that we incorporated into the design, wrapped around a central space where people produce things, and then in each case a social facility, either a daycare center or some other kind of social support service. And the houses as they are today, they've almost not changed at all. They've been wonderfully looked after. The people who live there are proud. They have a stake in the houses. And as you can see, the kind of quality of the housing has remained undiminished. But what I think is quite remarkable is the way in which people have decorated the interiors of the house. In this case, with this lady, she has been very enterprising in collecting the labels of pilchards cans and laid them out flat and made a form of wallpaper out of them. And it creates a fantastically rich and varied internal decoration, and in many, many ways builds on the traditions of the Ndebele people whose work I showed you before, those very, very brightly colored interiors, except in this case they're using cast-off industrial waste in order to achieve the decorative quality. Another project that is under construction in Johannesburg at the moment that we're involved in is some inner city housing. This is an interesting slide because this is a view of Johannesburg. This road over here is an east-west highway, and underneath it runs this famous gold reef, which is the richest gold reef in the world. The grid of Johannesburg breaks down at this point over here in quite an interesting way. At the top point over there is a wonderful building designed by Gordon Bunshaft from SOM in the 1960s. It's the tallest building in Africa. But the reason why the grid breaks down over here is that this entire area is undermined. And some of the shafts are only 40 meters below ground level. If you walk on this surface during the daytime, you can sometimes actually feel the vibrations of the explosions underneath your feet. It's very difficult to build here because of this unstable conditions. And in fact, these roads and the position of the buildings is in fact a graphic representation of what happens under the ground. That these buildings have been located in the specific positions they have in order to contend with this undermining under the ground. So it's a fantastic sort of sense of reading above the ground what happens under the ground is a literal translation. But we developed this site over here, which is close to a railway station and part of the route of people into the city. And it was an attempt to try and build inner city housing in Johannesburg for people who are living in these kinds of conditions. This is an old Modern movement slab block, 11.5, 12 meters wide, abandoned because of the transformation of Johannesburg city center. The owners weren't interested in the building any longer. They'd moved out of the city and built presumably other buildings on the outskirts of the city where it was safer. And it had been occupied by squatters. And these people were living in an office building with no services whatsoever, cooking food over coal and paraffin fires, and it really is a death trap. What I think is remarkable, though, is that the fire escapes have become social spaces. They're hangout spaces for people to meet and talk. Very much, I think, what the modern movement would have liked to have seen in many of their buildings, but never happened. But what we developed was, and it was interesting because I saw some work of some students today dealing with similar issues, developed a series of courtyarded buildings. Johannesburg is quite a dangerous city. People don't like to bring children up in the city. What we did was, in order to be able to build family housing in the city, developed a series of courtyards that were absolutely safe, that were lifted one level above the plane of the street of the city, and cut in to this, though, a public way which was really supported by all sorts of shops and markets and so on, and then placed all the communal facilities, such as washing facilities, drying and laundry facilities, in close proximity to the street so that there would be surveillance continually for people. The section of the building I thought I'd show you is that the principle that we worked on was, and it's something that we insist on in all the jobs that we do, is that the ground plane of the city is a democratic plane, and no one shall ever have the right, we believe, to privatize that space, so that all spaces in the city, we believe, should be accessible to all the citizens of the city. In this case over here, what we did is we provided shops, workshops, and some storage space for the informal markets on the ground plane, lifted and created a second ground plane, and then wrapped the housing around that. And what we did is provided the family accommodation where children would be living with parents on the first two levels with direct access into the courtyard, pulled the kitchens out as noses into the space so that there would be surveillance from the kitchen, and then provided loft space above that for young couples, singles, and others. These houses are under construction at the moment and are being built at market rate, but work out in US dollar terms of between $5,000 and $8,000 US dollars a unit for the duplexes, and about $4,500 US dollars for the duplexes. So it's a very different system of valuing things that we have. What we did was, this is a model that we built to explain the idea, is that at the entrances to the courtyards we provided pensioner housing, two little flats for pensioners with windows that acted as eyes on whoever came in and entered and exited the space, so that you had inbuilt surveillance 24 hours a day, literally. And then on the outside of the building, a fairly tough building, which really deals with the idea of protecting people from the city. And it's unashamedly that, with deck access and a whole lot of issues that I think were rejected by Europeans, but which we're finding still work in South Africa, particularly with regard to this kind of housing. I'm now going to sort of shift and then talk about work done after 1994, but talk to you also about other work that we've done. This is work done in Cape Town, and the reason why I wanted to show you the work in Cape Town is to tell you that Cape Town is on the coast. It's on the southernmost tip of Africa. It's where the Indian and Atlantic Oceans meet, and it's a Mediterranean climate, and it requires a completely different context for working. This is a project that we did some time ago. It's a family home with a fantastic view of Cape Town, but the construction system has changed entirely. It's not framed. It's a homogeneous form of construction and then plastered and painted in one single color. A preoccupation, again, with questions of how it is that one can deal with sunlight and control the sunlight, allow winter sun in, exclude summer sun, and so on. But also because of a fantastic landscape, to always go up vertically so that you capture views of the landscape, whereas on the high veld one remains horizontal all the time. Absolutely fantastic views overlooking Cape Town. And quite a different form of construction from the kind of buildings that I showed you before, because it's a different city in a completely different climate and context. Another little house which is close to the sea, which we've just completed, which is a little U-shaped courtyard house with a fantastic view to the sea in that direction. Wonderful views of mountains that wrap around in that direction there. But where the prevailing wind is a southeaster, and because it's where the Indian and Atlantic Oceans meet, you get huge, huge winds, up to 125 kilometers an hour. And they can knock people over. So the idea is to really look towards a view, but accept that the view is where the wind is, so one creates then a back courtyarded space, which then protects one from the wind when the wind blows, and one can still be outside but be protected. This gives an indication of where the house is located. It's located in a position up there with fantastic views over a small fishing harbor and towards Table Mountain in the background. And again, a very different form of construction. You can see here a lot of timber that we use, because you can use timber down there. It's a soft climate, it's hot, humid, and a homogeneous form of construction, which really, in a sense, is very different from what we employed in the Highveld. It's built, you get a sense of the views from the house towards the Table Mountain and the Hout Bay, which wraps around over here, with the fishing village below. It's built on a sand dune, which is quite an experience to build on, particularly with regard to sand fleas. I used to go to site visits and get eaten alive. And then inside views of the house. Again, in a climate like you have in Cape Town, which is a Mediterranean climate, this is a courtyarded house that is under construction at the moment, a very compact house and a very compact urban site. But I think what's interesting about it is now we're confronting the idea of not necessarily having to join all the spaces in the house contiguously to one to the other, so that you never go outside to go inside. In this case, it's two very, very simple bands of accommodation, a bedroom study space, a set of spaces, and living, dining, kitchen spaces, and a special reading room at the top over there. And if you want to move from the one set of rooms to the other rooms, you just simply walk across the courtyard, admittedly undercover, but you go outside to go inside. And in that kind of climate, you can do it. In Johannesburg, you can't, because you get deathly cold winter nights, and it's very, very uncomfortable. So this is sort of an attempt to sort of respond to the climate and to try and figure out ways and means of being able to deal with the climate. Also, because of its climate, one can use stick construction. This is something I learned from my stay in America, and this is a stick-built building. So, in a sense, our work has changed in terms of the kind of buildings that we make, in the sense of a technological change, which had to do with a shift from one city to another. This is now a set of buildings that we're doing at the present time for the new government. This is, for example, very, very typical of our work. This is a new set of law courts outside Pretoria. And our brief from the government was a very interesting one. They said that symbolically, the law came to represent one kind of thing in South Africa during the years of apartheid to black people, which was that it was used as a blunt instrument of repression. And they wanted us to develop an idea of how to design law courts that would be accessible, friendly, and not intimidating, which was fantastic, because I have a huge suspicion of the law at the best of times. So essentially what we developed within very tight budgetary constraints, an idea of law courts that would front onto a gigantic big concourse that would connect one part of the town of Attridgeville to the other part of Attridgeville, and in which would be accommodated a variety of social activities, both in terms of legal advice officers and all sorts of other social services, but also would be a place where people would meet and eat. And vendors would sell food there informally, people would meet and talk, there would be benches and so on. So in a sense, it became a gigantic big public concourse, of which on the one side you had social services, and on the other side you had the courts. It's also under construction at the moment, and hopefully will be completed quite soon. But also the character of the building, we were quite deliberate in trying to change it. In this case, it's industrial, and I'll get back to the reason for why the language is so unashamedly industrial. But we wanted to confront the idea of the static, symmetrical law courts that was so synonymous with the application of the law under the years of apartheid, and to try and find another expression for it. A housing project that I thought you would be, interested in from the point of view that it's maybe the ideal housing project. We're doing 4 or 5 of these projects around the country, pilot projects for the Swedish government, CEDA, the Swedish Development Agency. And their view was that there was too much unimaginative public housing being built in South Africa, because housing policy in South Africa is framed in such a way that really the only outcome in terms of housing policy is one house, one plot, a small box on a tiny handkerchief of ground. And this is causing our cities to expand outwardly and is disabling communities who are getting further and further displaced from the city cores. So the Swedish government said to us that they wanted us to build experimental housing. They didn't want us to consult with anyone. They wanted us to be as imaginative as we could, and they didn't care if the housing failed. So that's our brief. So we just, within very, very rigid cost constraints, obviously, these houses have to qualify for the housing subsidy, which means that in US dollar terms, they can't cost more than about $1,500 to $1,800 each. So they were very, very tiny houses. But what we developed was a system of housing that really comprised some thin tubes of accommodation, which were 2.7, 9-foot wide, and were double-storied and triple-storied in some cases. And what we did was, if this is the sidewalk over here, we created an in-between space that 2 houses shared, which was covered with a roof. But then what we did is we took the staircases and put them outside the house, which was okay because the staircases were covered with a roof. And this became a gigantic big porch and became a semi-public space that mediated between the sidewalk and the front door of the house. But by taking the staircase out of the house, we created infinite flexibility in that you could, if you wanted as a householder, rent the ground floor, convert it into a shop, and live upstairs and be able to have independent access to the top floor. This was just a series of proposals that we made in looking at how we would develop the housing. Interestingly enough, this housing is based upon the work that Mart Stam and Ernst Mayr did in Frankfurt in the 1920s, some of which didn't get built, which were very, very narrow houses, again, 9 to 10 foot wide houses. And their idea with the narrow house, which was double-storied, was that you could verticalize the house, even though it was very small. By making it very narrow, it would always appear much taller than it actually was, so that you didn't land up designing houses that looked like poor people's housings. They had a kind of an honorable scale and dignity associated with them. This is the housing, and these project, this really is a sort of exploration of what the housing looked like when it was built and what we would hope it would look like in 10 years' time, the registration of use and time and weather on the buildings. And the idea that the building fabric is going to weather is a great idea, a great concern of ours, and we love that idea. We encourage people to paint things on our buildings and to scrawl graffiti on them and to plaster posters on them and do all kinds of things, because I think that kind of adds vitality to the building skin, unlike a lot of modern buildings which have to be dry cleaned every 5 years. And then the really tricky piece, which was the 3-story building, we had to reduce the loading on the first 2 floors, so it was built out of timber and then corrugated iron. It's a bit wobbly when the wind blows. But people are living there and they're enjoying it. And what's very interesting about building these vertical buildings in this part of South Africa, which is a fairly traditional township, is that most of the people who've lived in this part of Port Elizabeth, where this housing is located, have never lived above the ground. And now all of a sudden they have the opportunity to live in a 3-story unit and to actually look out over the city and in a sense possess the city through their gaze. And it's an exceptional kind of thing for many of these people. It's the most thrilling thing for many of them that's happened to them in their lives in these townships. And there's something about that idea of the gaze and the possession of the gaze, which I think actually helps people who are disadvantaged or suffer all kinds of deprivation to be able to at least claim that gaze as theirs. And that's certainly what the 3-story building has worked at, though many people abandon the top floor when the wind really blows and come downstairs. But it was experimental housing. No one owns this housing. It's rented. And I must say, there's a huge, been a hugely positive response to it. And we're building some similar stuff. This gives us sort of sense of how the streetscape works and the edge that the houses make to the sidewalk. The sidewalk's not yet complete. And some of the houses have roller top doors, and they're going to be developed into shops. And this gives a sense of how that interstitial threshold space that I think Aldo van Eyck, we were very influenced by his work, the idea of the bladder space, this big space that kind of comes off the sidewalk and becomes part of the house with the front door set back from that. And I must say it's a very successful social space. You know, the idea of when people move into houses, they usually extend them almost immediately. Well, then why spend a lot of money building a concrete block wall and it's going to get knocked down, put a corrugated iron sheet up there, design it in such a way that they can take the corrugated sheet, iron off, lay it horizontal, and use it for the roof for the extension. And this is just, for me, a very powerful image of a woman who just moved into one of the houses, a tenant. The first thing she did was to set up her sewing machine so she could make business. Interesting enough, the first service that goes into all the shack settlements being built in South Africa now is not sanitation, it's not water, clean water, it's in fact electrical power. And the reason for that is that it's very cheap, it's very easy to get it in very quickly, it doesn't require a huge physical movement of people in and out of the houses, but more importantly, once people have power, they can make business, they can actually generate wealth. And it's a very interesting proposition. I'm going to go very quickly through this, but a series of daycare centers. A lot of the work that is commissioned in South Africa now by the state is given out in public competition, and we won this competition just recently for the design of 8 small daycare centers throughout the Western Cape province. But it's really about a set of buildings that are shaped in response to horizontal plane with certain wind conditions and an attempt to create a sheltered courtyard space where the roofs actually work in such a way to protect that courtyard from the winds. Other work which is quite interesting because it's quite naughty work, this is what really is almost like our National Theatre, and it's a very hallowed building called the Baxter Theatre in Cape Town. And I know the director of the Baxter Theatre, and we wanted to proletarianize the Baxter Theatre and bring township people into the theatre. So what we've done is we're building a set of 4 theatres around the perimeter of the old theatre that are tucked in underneath this gigantic big space, which you can actually see over there, which will become people's theatres, and where local township groups can have free access to the theatres to stage their own productions. And it has caused quite a stir in Cape Town, but we've finally got the funding and we're going to go ahead and build them. But a sort of sense of, you know, I love showing that little theatre there because that's a theatre for 250 people and it could fit into, 5 of them could fit into this gigantic big concert hall. This concert hall is empty most of the year. So we thought of maybe making these as wooden structures and placing them inside the concert hall, but that was just too much for the Board of Trustees. So they let us put these little tuck-away theatres underneath the main roof, which at least was a victory for us. The last 2 projects, and then I'll finish. One of the consequences of apartheid, which was quite devastating, was the application of the Group Areas Act. And that was that in the 1960s, huge areas of South African cities were declared white areas where black communities lived and colored communities lived. And whole communities were uprooted from the places where they lived and taken elsewhere in order to spatially segregate them from white people. In Cape Town alone, about 180,000 people were forcibly moved from where they lived and deposited elsewhere. In one area alone, District 6, 60,000 people were moved out of one single area of the city over a 2-year period. What has happened now is through the new government and through the new constitution, the rights of those people for access to that land has been granted back to them. And through a land claims court, many of these families are being resettled on the land that was stolen from them 40 years ago. And we're involved in one project, which is in Tramway Road, which is a community of 40 people who lived in Sea Point, which is a really lovely affluent suburb of Cape Town. They were moved out 40 years ago. These are the two most important things that happened in this community's life. On the right-hand side over here is the law, the order that was given to them to vacate their properties, and on the right over there is the law, the order that was given them the right to return to their properties. It was a devastation to this community, whom I've got to know very well. One of the leaders of the community got it a week or two after having received the notice to leave. They'd lived there for about 5 generations previously, got in his car, drove up the coast road and hanged himself. This community is very interesting because the piece of ground that they occupied was never developed. It remained as a park. And there was a church adjacent to the park where they used to worship, an Anglican church. They were dispersed right throughout the Cape Peninsula. For the last 40 years, every Sunday, they've been coming back to worship at the church, this community of people. They formed their own, this is the old tramway road which they lived in, and these are images of the old residents. I show this because this is a dance troupe from 40 years ago, and some of the women in that photograph over there, which was taken about 5 years ago, were these young kids. These kids waited 40 years, and they're now adults over there to return home. And it's quite an extraordinary experience to work on the project. What is very interesting about it is that it's a community of people who've decided to come back home. They're rich and poor. Some have done very well. Others have not done so well. They're pensioners and extended families. To ensure that they've been given the land back by the state together with compensation to each family, to ensure equity amongst all the families. They agreed that no property shall be bigger or smaller than any other neighbors. So all the properties are approximately 5 meters wide by 25 meters long. Each family has agreed to contribute 1/3 of their monthly income to a pot to help to pay for the housing, which means that the richer families are going to subsidize the poorer families. The land is held in a community trust. No individual family shall own tenure to any of the properties. And it is really like a commune, a kind of, in a way, the ideal communist commune. But this is a group of people who've suffered for 40 years and are determined to make it work and want the whole community to come back. So essentially, we've developed one of the things that people said to us, because originally we wanted to build terrace houses, and many of these families had lived in council flats, which were pretty miserable apartments on the Cape Flats. And the one requirement they made for the housing is that we want to live in a house that we can walk around. That was the only concern that they had. So what we did is developed a 5 meter wide a 5 meter wide subdivision with a 3 meter wide house with a sidewalk which takes you to the backyard, where you can actually build at a later date flatlets and further accommodation for the extended family. And then looked at the traditional Cape system of urban housing, where you have a street, you park your car outside your house so you can keep an eye on it. You have a little stoep or veranda that then forms the kind of semi-public or interstitial space between the privacy of the house and the actual publicness of the sidewalk. These houses, you get the sense of how the houses address the question of the street, and because it's a sloping site, we can create a change in level between the stoep and the actual sidewalk itself, so that there's a sort of sense of being elevated. And the final project is the Museum of Apartheid, and it's on a very interesting site in Port Elizabeth. We won it in competition about 3-4 years ago. We're only starting construction now, all sorts of complications. But it's in a very important part of the country. It's in an area called Red Location, which is where it was one of the sites of struggle. During the years 1950, 1960, 1970, it was where the first armed wing unit of the ANC was formed. It's the home of Govan Mbeki, who's the father of our president, Thabo Mbeki. It's a place where many of the political leaders of South Africa came from. It has an interesting history, though, which is what we wanted to deal with in our Museum of Apartheid. This is not a museum like you would build in the United States on a greenfield site away from where people live. The site is a very important historic site. People live here. There are over 100,000 people who live in the surrounding area. The Apartheid Museum is going to be built right inside of that community. It's going to create work and employment for many people who live in that community, and they welcome it. But it's going to tell the story of their struggle. But this set of buildings, this is Red Location today, started off its life as a Boer concentration camp. The British invented concentration camps, not the Germans. They incarcerated Afrikaner women and children during the Boer War at the turn of the century. 26,000 Afrikaner women and children died in these concentration camps. An equal number of black women and children also died in the concentration camps. And what happened at Red Location is that the British made a prefabricated concentration camp outside Port Elizabeth. At the end of the war, the Boer War, they disassembled it and took it to Red Location, reassembled it there, and a battalion of British soldiers was located there for about 10 years, and then they left, and local black families moved in. So it's a place that tells an extraordinary story about a set of buildings that were transplanted, were originally used as a concentration camp, became a military establishment, and then were occupied by black people, and then obviously the people who lived there were part of the struggle. So this is Red Location today, and these are the old bungalows from the concentration camp. This is a picture we got from the archive showing the form of construction. This whole area is declared a national monument. And what we're involved in is not only building the Apartheid Museum, but upgrading these houses and restoring them to what they were before. One of the problems we have, though, are the shacks that have been added to the houses, because we have to find accommodation for these people, because the idea is that we'll restore the original bungalows as family homes, but that we need to find some way of dealing with the question of the shacks. And that's part of the reason why the project was delayed, because no one could actually come up with a suitable solution. We now seem to find a solution, which is we're going to leave the shacks as they are and just upgrade them and provide decent services. But the Red Location this is the site of Red Location over here. This is a typical South African township. This is the railway line that people move up and down every day to sell their labor in the city. In this case, though, across the way are major motor assembly plants. Port Elizabeth is where many of the cars that are sold in Africa are assembled: Mercedes, Benz, BMW, Ford, etc. And that bridge over there was used by workers to move from their residences to the motor assembly plants on the other side of the railway line. There must have been at any time 20 to 25,000 people that would cross that footbridge every day. And our proposal was to locate the Apartheid Museum in this position over here, and to strengthen this cross-access over here, and at the point of intersection to create a space for the 3 or 4 buildings that we're required to. It's not just an Apartheid Museum, it's going to be a cultural center for the entire area, and it'll comprise a museum, some housing, an art gallery, an art school, a hall, and a small library, and it's a 10-year project. The first building that will be built will be the Museum of Apartheid. This just gives a sense of showing how the new cultural center fits into the existing matrix of houses. We lost very, very few houses, and in some cases we kept the existing houses and simply upgraded them and made them into retail outlets. This, though, is the most important image, and when I spoke to you previously about the kind of industrial character of the law courts and many of the buildings that we've done, I was involved in helping to design some posters during the 80s for COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and this is one of their typical posters. This is not one that I did. It's a lovely poster nonetheless, but what is interesting in all these posters is that whenever buildings are represented, only 3 building types are represented. Double-storied building, which represents the school, the single-storied, serried roofed, which represent the township houses, and the sawtooth roof representing the factory. And in fact, the factory became, in many, many people's minds, a symbol of civic dignity and virtue, because it was the place where the struggle for freedom was fought in South Africa, because it was here that the trade unions fought the internal struggle. And so people identify, in a sense, the industrial building as a place, in a sense, that has a kind of public sensibility in terms of building for them. And in fact, are mistrustful of all other building types. which to them represented the authority of apartheid. So in a sense, what we did in this particular competition is we picked up on that idea and we developed the South Roof Light as a kind of language that was developed for all the building types. The top is the art school, that's the library, that's the big hall, and that's the art gallery. And what we did is picked up on the idea of serried South roof lights, and then adjusted each roof light to suit the particular purpose for which the space underneath was intended. And interestingly enough, when the proposals, the project was presented to the community, they actually understood it and were very pleased that we'd made that connection. So in a sense, it's rewriting the idea of public building in a completely new language, which is accessible to people and which they identify with virtue. The other consideration that we had is something that we've been working on for a long time. The image is from the Smithson's book, and it really has to do with another idea of architecture, which is not an idea in which you have freestanding forms in space, in which the sculptural kind of quality of the form is all that counts. It really has to do with an architecture which is a retiring architecture. It's a background architecture which forms the frame against which the conduct of daily life takes place. And it's really about an architecture which is more a frame and a scaffolding rather than a freestanding form in space. This is a taxi rank that we designed many years ago in Soweto, but which was designed so that it would become much more than a taxi rank. And it's now a taxi rank, it's a bus rank, it's a shopping center, it's a place where people meet, and it's also a place where people sleep at nighttime. So we've been intrigued for a long time about that idea of a scaffolding, a framework, which can then become inhabited in unimaginable ways by people who are very, very creative when they're left to their own devices. This is the first intervention we made, which was to build a road. These were originally for trees until we discovered that the local people kept goats, and the goats ate all the trees. So we just decided to make them into seats, and in fact, they're much nicer as seats anyhow. But this is a taxi rank that we developed along the road. This is one of the buildings that we're busy at the moment rehabilitating and making it into offices, community offices. But this is the full extent of our intervention. We simply put up a roof, we put up a scaffolding, we created a series of horizontal surfaces that people could sit or sell things from. And unfortunately, I don't have a slide of it now, but this is, if you can imagine, a very colorful marketplace now. We even went to the extent of providing fixing points for people to actually be able to put up their own signs. People pick up in the queues and go to town, and they make it into something which is inconceivable to the architect, because I think we simply just don't possess the kind of infinite sensibilities that hundreds of people possess in acting on a piece of architecture. What we tend to do is we tend to make it very dull. Give people a bit of freedom, and they make it into something very rich. The other issue that we looked at was in the Apartheid Museum was a kind of cultural artifact which is prevalent throughout South Africa. It's called a memory box. These are wooden boxes, beautifully colored and decorated, that many, many families keep. And they're in fact, because I think of the insecurity that many people lived under apartheid, what people would do is they'd build these memory boxes and keep mementos of their family and of a memory of their life. In many, many cases, these people were migrant workers whose family lived in the rural areas, they lived in the cities. They would have one of these memory boxes under their bed, and they would use that as a kind of a way of collecting and remembering the place that they came from. And they've now become kind of almost institutionalized in South African culture. And what we were intrigued by was this idea of memory boxes. And what we developed as an idea in the museum was that the museum, in fact, itself would comprise gigantic big memory boxes. And the idea behind that was that we didn't want to tell one story of apartheid, a meta-narrative of apartheid, which started at one point and went all the way through until liberation in 1994. But what we felt was that there were a number of different stories that needed to be told, and that each one of these memory boxes would tell its own particular story in its own particular way, and that people would be able to make up their minds about the impact of apartheid based upon their individual readings of the contents and the themes that were picked up in each one of the memory boxes. This is a typical plan of the museum with a taxi rank on the outside over here, usual kind of gallery stuff, restaurant and front door and reception area and stuff. But this is, in fact, the most important part. This is a a hall of columns which remembers the people who lost their lives in the struggle for apartheid. And these are the 12 memory boxes that comprise. The exterior of the building was very difficult to deal with because these are extremely high volumes. They're 16 meters in height, which is the equivalent of, I don't know, a 5-story building. And we had to sort of articulate the edges, the facades of the building in such a way that they would be scaled down to the scale of the houses, which are single-storied and double-storied in the area. And this was an attempt to be able to do that. These are offices and library spaces and then obviously seating spaces on the outside for the taxi rank. But contained within the space, they have a huge big south-lit space, which brings light in a very particular way with these gigantic big memory boxes that are contained inside of it. And then all sorts of elements like the auditorium, which are buildings within buildings, contained like almost small baldacchinos inside of the larger space. These are some sectional studies of the memory boxes, and they're huge structures. They're 12 meters high, which is probably the equivalent of a 4-story building. And they sit very mutely inside of the space with no acknowledgement on the outside of them of what is contained within. And in a sense, I had done a lot of reading of the work of Andreas Heisen at that time, who spoke about the twilight of memory. And in a sense, the kind of literal translation of what we were doing is that outside the museum was the present day, inside the boxes would contain the memories, and this in-between space, this interstitial space, was the twilight space, where in fact people would kind of meditate upon what they'd seen, and in which they would make the connection between both what had happened in the past and what was confronted, what confronted them in the conduct of their daily life at the present time. One of the wicked things that we did here is that the roof windows were designed in such a way. The Afrikaners commemorate a day on the 16th of December, which is called the Battle of the Blood River, which had to do with what they rewrote history as being a victory over the Zulu warriors whom they encountered on their way into Natal. And the story goes that the rivers ran red with the blood of Zulu warriors. Well, it turns out now that, with history being reconsidered in South Africa, nothing like that happened. In fact, the Boer commandos turned tail when they saw the Zulu impi and ran out of Natal. So, but what they did in the Voortrekker Monument is they designed a special monument to commemorate the 16th of December. And what they did was, on the 16th of December every year, a shaft of light would come down through an oculus at the top of the Voortrekker Monument and pick up a plaque on the floor commemorating this great victory over the Zulu people. Well, we've done exactly the same thing in our museum, except that it tells a very, very different story. And it's a sort of way of confronting, again, history and the way in which history and memory collide, and the way in which history has so many different readings and memory has so many different readings to so many different people. Just a series of models that really try and pick up and provide an understanding of how space is modulated within the museum. And this really is a projection of how the light would in fact work on that particular day, the 16th of December. Right, I think that is the end. Thank you very, very much. Questions? Yeah.
Joe will be happy to answer some questions if there are any.
Downtown Johannesburg,
Yeah?
re-inhabiting those abandoned buildings?
Sorry?
Is there any hope of rehabilitation of the abandoned
Yeah.
buildings in downtown Johannesburg?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are many architects working on projects to do precisely that. But what you have to do is move people out before it can be done, because the buildings need to be provided with services. They need to be made safe. You can imagine in those buildings, people put up makeshift partitions from one family to another. They're in an office space and they're cooking food over a paraffin stove. And it's really a disaster waiting to erupt at any time. But certainly in Johannesburg, we're in fact working on a project in Cape Town on a 20-story building, which is again a typical modern movement slab block, looking at ways of being able to transform the office accommodation into family housing. So we're looking at that. But the strange thing about a lot of modern architecture, which has been designed in such a sort of specific way to suit only one purpose, is it becomes almost impossible to adjust to new needs over time. And that's what we're certainly finding with mainly the office buildings in our cities, which have fallen into disuse and would be a fantastic resource to be inhabited by families, but are proving very, very difficult to adjust to those kinds of uses, particularly in terms of providing decent services to the units of accommodation. Yeah.
That kind of leads into my question, actually. When you were designing housing, multiple unit housing, like a two-story housing for people, and the house with the first floor courtyard and stuff, were you designing with an eye to adding services later?
No.
I get the impression they wouldn't have a sewer to start with.
No. All that housing that I showed you that we're involved in is fully serviced. Heated, well, it's hot and cold running water and electricity, absolutely. Yeah.
That housing, various different housing projects that you worked on, and you discussed a material palette that could be transformed. How much involvement of the actual occupants is undertaken? You do interviews, you work with them?
Sure.
There was, in the original, earlier housing, there was people actually producing the blocks.
Yeah.
How much now?
Well, I think the only projects that we've been involved in where there hasn't been any engagement of people was that experimental work that we're doing for the Swedes. And that was done quite deliberately as a provocation, that we didn't want to, they wanted to put some experimental housing up quickly, and they felt that engaging people, they wanted to put the housing up and then test the reaction of people to the housing rather than work the other way around. I think part of the problem, I think we're beginning to learn now in South Africa about what real public participation means, because in a way it doesn't mean that people tell you what they want, but it really means people buy into what you're providing them with. And what has been very difficult is finding that kind of point where, for example, in the Alexandra housing project, the first one that I showed you, we built houses for 100 families. It took us 18 months to reach agreement on the housing that we were to provide. It was a huge waste of time, and I think we could have circumvented it if we'd been a little bit smarter about how we'd thought about how people would participate. But we went in, it was the first project we'd ever done, and the people were going to tell us what they wanted, and they didn't know what the hell they wanted, so we were kind of skirting around each other for 18 months until in the end we said, well, this is what we think you need, and they said, fantastic, build it, Yeah. We pump it all the way up from northern Natal. No, it's a hot, dry climate. When you say water, use a lot of water, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Yeah, well, the evaporative cooler doesn't use a huge amount of water. It's just simply a kind of a screen that is kept damp, and you just pass the air across it. It's not a huge pool of water or anything. It's in fact very resourceful in terms of water. Yeah, the evaporative cooling system is a fantastic system for a hot, dry climate. The only problem with it is that you've got to make sure that that screen that you pass the water across is replaced every 6 months or so, because I think they had a big problem at the BBC building in London with Legionnaire's disease. You get fungus that grows on it, and then you can pollute the inside of the building with a problematic thing. But it's a hot, dry climate. We do have a certain amount of water, but yeah, we've got to be careful about water. What's interesting about Johannesburg is that in the wealthier parts of Johannesburg, there's an entirely new exotic landscape that has emerged because of the settling of very wealthy people into that landscape. We've got an insect life that doesn't belong to Africa. We've got kind of grasshoppers from Australia and caterpillars from Brazil and stuff like that. And it's maintained at huge cost. It's a very beautiful landscape, but it's entirely exotic. And now with water curbs, you're seeing that whole landscape change back to an indigenous landscape because it's simply not able to support something like that with the kind of high cost of water.
Questions?
The current value of the land plummeting, is that impacting these public projects?
No, you know, the fall in the rand is quite an interesting thing because, you know, the new government has been incredibly successful in sorting out the economy. I think we're one of the few countries in the world that have a deficit. That we don't have a deficit. We balance our books at the end of every year. Or we have a 1.2% deficit. So we don't spend more money than we have. What has happened to the rand is we're quite naive still probably as a country. We don't understand how international finance works very well. We have a free-floating currency, and speculators have been playing with our currency and driving it down. So it's lost a lot of value over the last 6 months, but it's slowly regaining value because it's a good, solid currency. And interesting enough, the government has initiated a commission to find out who the culprits are. But in terms of the fall in the rand, it doesn't affect the domestic price of commodities significantly except for imported goods, and that's mainly fuel. What it's done, though, is it's curiously enough given a huge surge to our export markets and also made South Africa very attractive to foreign tourists. So there have been good things that have happened as a result of the collapse in the rand.
Well, thanks very much.